don't even know what they do for us anymore. We don't have to worry about that. It's an enterprise control. Oh, we outsource that to another organisation. Another team deals with all that. That's not our responsibility. So these are just some of the things I've heard from clients, so project managers and product owners when conducting audits this year alone, if not the last couple of months. And from a security perspective, this isn't great. And the sad thing is, this kind of response and these kind of comments have been around for a long time and they haven't changed. So some of you might recognise the KiwiCon poster from November 2009. I do want to point out, I wasn't even in high school yet, and yet here I am 16 years later pointing out some of the exact same things that were said then. It's managed by a third party. It's handled in the cloud. It's insert standard here compliant, and that you've contracted out that risk. So the thing is, while nothing's changed with these responses, so much has changed within the technological space. You know, more and more organisations are starting to outsource their infrastructures, their platforms. They're moving to the public cloud spaces, and you've got tech giants like Microsoft and AWS that are becoming more and more of a global presence. So these things being said then, not great. Those exact same things being said 16 years later, now that's a problem. And that's one that I want to emphasise today, because none of it matters. These excuses don't matter, because as the poster so eloquently puts it, hackers don't give a shit. And so all of these comments and all of these kind of responses, they bubble down to one overarching question. And I really hope there are people in the audience that get this reference, because every time I would say it, this was the first thing I thought of. So it's not whose line is it anyway. Responsibility. Specifically, whose responsibility is it anyway? So, hi guys, I'm Dana Windsor. I'm a senior security consultant at Bastion Security, and as a security consultant, to be able to give the best advice and guidance possible, we need to be able to see and at least understand the full picture. And that means you also need to be aware of and understand the full picture too. So that includes where your information is stored, how securely it's stored, who manages what, and whether or not there are any security concerns or issues that could affect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of the solution or the information stored in it. You know, the core model of information security. You don't necessarily have to manage it on a day-to-day basis, but you still need to be aware. And some people just don't realise the depth of this question and how easily it can be forgotten or just not even considered. So for the purposes of today, I will be delving into highlighting responsibilities and just being aware that our jobs are transcending across multiple different teams, different organisations, and different service offerings. I'll also be touching on what could go wrong if there is a gap, and then also what can be done to mitigate this. So while I'll be primarily focusing on responsibilities for external parties to the supply chain, some people just don't realise that responsibilities internally can also fall through the gaps, and so I'll briefly be touching on across different teams internally as well. So a very common saying is that your organisation is only as secure as its weakest link, and that can sometimes be the third parties. You know, as they're not always on the forefront of our minds to confirm it's secure. You know, we cannot confirm security on what we cannot see, and this can lead to us missing gaps, especially if they're small. And the thing is, it can also be within our organisation as well. You know, we could easily be staring at something or the same thing every day and still miss something that's right in front of our faces. Small gap. You know, I do it, everyone does it. It's human nature, and that's why we have reviews and another set of eyes that go over things. But the assumption is that third parties will be securing their own stuff, and that other teams will be doing their jobs. And malicious actors are going to be weaponizing this trust that we put into our third parties and the other teams within the organisation to secure their stuff and do their jobs. But what we forget is that by consuming their service, their skill set, it becomes our stuff too. So when you're engaging and procuring a new solution or system from a third party, it is essentially becoming an extension of your organisation. So your boundaries need to move to include that part that you're outsourcing. And while you may outsource that work, whatever it is, platform, infrastructure, people, whatever, that also means that you're also inheriting their risks as well. And that could just as much affect you as it can them. Because what happens if your third party's minimum level of security doesn't align with your minimum level of security? You know, they differ across the globe, even between New Zealand and Australia. So I've got New Zealand on the left and Australia on the right. And so this is for their minimum cryptographic standards, their cryptographic algorithm. So while both countries are required to use advanced encryption standards, so AES, the minimum requirements for Australia range from 112 bits for their non-classified data to 192 bits for their top secret data. And that doesn't come close to our 256 minimum. And the annoying thing is they're still planning to support 128 and 192 right up until 2030. So it's a little bit concerning. And it just kind of just shows the difference between different countries. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that their security aligns with your minimum standards where possible, or at the very least know where to implement compensating controls. So while third parties may be the ones to actually experience the breach, other high-profile organisations are going to be the ones who are actually suffering the consequences. Take the Qantas breach, for example. I won't go into too much detail. I'm sure you would have all heard of it. But if you'd asked me the name of the third-party supplier, especially in those first couple of weeks of the third party whose platform actually got breached, I wouldn't have been able to tell you because every news reference called them just third-party supplier. And I mean, just think of it. I've said Qantas breach. It wasn't a platform that they managed. It was just one that they consumed as a service. But at the end of the day, it was Qantas information that they'd been entrusted to secure that was compromised, and therefore their reputation, their name that was in the firing line. They suffered the consequences, and not just from the initial breach either. So if you remember my talk from last year, where I delved into online scams and how they're successful, malicious actors are going to use and capitalize on the fact that it's well known Qantas information was compromised, and also a lot of it. Because a lot of the time, one breach does not stop at the initial breach, but can cause so many more issues after the fact. Recently, Qantas has reported that phishing emails have been coming out, contacting Qantas account holders, either enticing them to click a link to change their password or provide more personal details. And so this enables malicious actors to legitimize those phishing emails by relying on and benefiting from the breach. And the sad thing is, it's not necessarily always the same malicious actors that caused the breach in the first place. There was also another attack recently that targeted the Collins Aerospace Muse software, which is a cloud-based platform used for electronic check-ins and boardings. And so that pretty much just went offline. Many systems were disrupted. Major airports were unable to electronically check people in and complete the boardings. It was just massive. And especially in major ports around Europe and the UK, so Heathrow, Brussels and Berlin were probably the main ones that were targeted, that were affected. So things were at a standstill for hours. It inconvenienced a lot of people, a lot of organisations, and it caused a flow-on of effect for further delays as well. So when we think about it on a longer-term scale, 12 months before March 2025, Cordia Cyber Report highlights that 19% of businesses interviewed experienced a cyber attack or an incident through a third party. This is the fourth most common instance after email phishing attacks, unsecured websites, and unsecured applications. Also, 35% of respondents perceived that cyber attacks or data leaks through third-party suppliers are the biggest threats to their business cybersecurity posture. So I'm sure that this number is only going to continue rising because of the cyber attacks coming through third-party breaches that took more than 2 months to resolve. The Cordia Cyber Report also highlights that 33% took between 2 to 4 months to resolve, and a further 12% took 5 months or longer. So these breaches are starting to affect businesses for a long time and also has a lasting effect. So I saw an article the other day highlighting that Qantas account holder information is now on the black market. That includes phone numbers, email addresses, residential addresses, date of birth, gender, a whole lot of personal information that's just now out there for everyone. And this initial breach happened in June, July. That's almost or around 4 months ago. So things are still not looking good for Qantas. They're still making global news, and they're also slated to lose millions. So there's still rumours and reports of who the third party was. You know, it's a bit more well known now. But for the first few weeks after it happened, they were only referred to as third party supplier in the news reports. Their name hasn't made as big a news story as Qantas has, or one of the around 40 other organisations and companies around the world that suffered from the same breach through the same third party. Companies like Toyota, Disney, IKEA, McDonald's, and just so many more. I could keep going. They're all major and global organisations and companies at the mercy of one third party. So these statistics and recent events demonstrate that responsibility and risk are not something to take lightly, whether it's within your own organisation or while working with another service provider. So some things have been established to try and help determine sharing responsibilities. You know, we have the aptly named shared responsibility model, and this is a security and compliance framework that outlines the responsibilities between cloud service providers and customers using public cloud. So there are different service models, including the most common ones, you know, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, the whole alphabet as a service, and the different amount of work being outsourced will result in a differing level of responsibilities for each party involved. This one here is the Microsoft's shared responsibility model, and so this highlights the division of operational and security responsibilities. Now, if you see in those first two columns under SaaS and PaaS, there are joint responsibilities. And so these lines aren't always clear, and that can lead to confusion and uncertainties and subsequently lead to vulnerabilities being introduced. For example, network control, like firewalls under the PaaS model, while the cloud service provider may be responsible for providing the base firewall services, the customer may also be responsible for setting their own firewall rules, alerting how they're configured, responses, and they cannot necessarily just rely on the default settings as well, particularly if they do not align with their organisation's requirements. Now we've got the Google shared responsibility model. So very similar, but also subtle differences as well. So the network is a sole responsibility of the cloud service provider for both PaaS and IaaS, though network security is either the cloud service provider or customer responsibility, depending on the model. So networking controls have been split into two different categories. Now looking at them side by side, seeing the different split of the responsibilities for the same, if not similar controls across the different models. It can get very confusing. You know, they're both shared responsibility models from two big organisations that are used by many across the world. And then there's this complete different demonstration from AWS. I'm not going to get into it. Not exactly clear, or not entirely clear, and just completely different again. So that's three major organisations around the world. So again, Google, Microsoft, and AWS, with three different demonstrations of shared responsibilities. And I'm sure everyone in this room, the organisations you work for, use at least one, if not a combination of the three. You could be hosting a platform on AWS, but using Entra ID by Microsoft, from Microsoft, or another integrator in the middle to help you manage the service. So the line for responsibilities is not clear, and it's going to blur across the organisations because the level of assumption is going to be carried across each one. And then you also have your smaller service providers who have their own interpretation of the model, and that can just further muddle the waters as we work with external parties around the world. So it's not just a simple case of wanting to pass on the baton or pawn off responsibility to someone else anymore. There could be genuine confusion and uncertainties around who is responsible for what, and it's the same thing also internally in organisations too. Who is supposed to be doing what isn't always that clear anymore, especially considering there's been a whole lot of redundancies, people leaving the country, and also moving jobs as well. So a big frustration of mine, and if you've worked with me, you've heard me rant on this quite often, is working with projects who are adamant on either de-scoping enterprise controls assuming compliancy because they should be managed at an enterprise level, or removing references and related findings entirely for those enterprise controls because project teams have no influence on remediating them. And while I agree to a certain point with the teams not being able to have influence on actually remediating them, they should be able to have that influence to drive up the chain. You know, the audits I've worked on across different organisations, both the public and private sector, have very similar findings related to those enterprise controls. So this includes documentation being out of date, not finalised, not signed off, not approved by management, enterprise security training or personnel screening being not conducted on a regular basis. And so these contribute to an elevated overall rating for security risks for those project teams. So instead of fearing these findings, project teams should be able to use this to push for compliancy from an enterprise level and from the top. Because frankly, it'd be for the betterment of the organisation as a whole and for future projects moving forward as well. Because let's be honest, if something does go wrong, no one, particularly the public, is going to care if it was Kevin from HR or Susie from SecOps that was supposed to be responsible for fixing whatever vulnerability or deficiency that was compromised. The organisation name will still be vilified in the news just the same. So these are just a small number of news headlines naming organisations that were affected by security breaches. Just a few more. And their presence in the news does take over. So going back to that Qantas breach, for example, this is just one line. There's 3 headlining articles, 1 editorial across 4 days, all in a row. Not one word of the third party. So that's a lot of news for Qantas. A lot of news for a platform they didn't even manage. And it's not just about managing or securing information, it's also about making sure that the solution as a whole is suitable for things like continuity, availability requirements. You know, who's responsible for bringing it back online if something goes offline? What about making sure thresholds have been defined and that they're not exceeded? These kind of questions are going to be asked during audits and are expected to be known or at least understood by the project teams, because it does start to transverse across different teams, different organisations, and again, different service offerings. So while the project teams may not necessarily be responsible for enacting the plans, for the monitoring, the managing of access or personnel, they need to understand who will be and whether they meet the requirements, and quite ultimately confirm that someone is actually doing it. So what can be done to mitigate these gaps? So as shown earlier, we had the 3 service responsibility models. Again, all 3 different major organisations, but all with subtle differences. So think about the service providers and the teams you're engaging with, and think about some of these questions. What model are they following? Is it clear to you in what you're expecting? Do they have security requirements in place that are deemed sufficient by your organisation? Do they align with compliance requirements such as the NZICM or PSR? So many questions around, these are just a few questions that need to be sorted out and understood from the very beginning. And that starts with due diligence. So during the procurement stage, it is up to you and your organisation to conduct a proper level of due diligence and confirm that security requirements align with your business objectives and compliance requirements. So just as you would conduct personnel screening or confirm a level of skill and knowledge for particular roles for employees, as I said before, the third party is becoming an extension of your organisation. So it's your responsibility to do what you need and what you can do to secure it from external and internal risk. Another thing you could do is establish non-functional and functional requirements. So making sure that you are confirming and sharing these with those service providers, the relevant teams, goes that one step further to maintaining the overall management of your information and data. It also provides a baseline for all those involved to align with, so there's no confusion. And it also provides assurance that the service being outsourced is adequate enough from an operational and security perspective to align with the risk appetite and expectations of your organisation. Another route is to complete a third-party risk assessment or risk assessments if you're using multiple service providers to understand the full extent of potential and possible situations or concerns and knowing what mitigations the third party already has in place. So this is where you can determine if the security considerations are sufficient enough for your organisation, and if not, it's about what level of risk can be accepted or what other compensating controls can be put in place if required. Or it can encourage you to look elsewhere. And you also need to take that one step further, because what about the other third parties that your third party is using to run their business? What considerations have been made for the overall supply chain, and how far down does it go? If a third party twice removed experiences an incident or gets compromised, how connected are they to your organisation? How likely is it that how likely is it that your organisation is next? So one of the things that recently came into play is the new information sharing standard, which came into effect on the 1st of July 2025, and it has a number of minimum guidelines and principles that need to be followed by every New Zealand government agency and also the non-government entities that provide a service to those agencies. So the third parties who have access to or a collection of government-held personal information. So it is noted that the standard is law and it's being issued under the Public Service Act, and that chief executives are to confirm that the agencies are actually complying with the standard. So there are three key principles from the information sharing standard that quite align with my discussion. The first is that agencies have assurance that personal information is adequately protected, that all parties are aware of and understand their responsibilities, and that the agency is clearly accountable for the personal information it holds at all times. So even if you're engaging with another provider to store or host the data, the agency whose information it is ultimately responsible and accountable for the security of that information and how it's stored. They need to know, and you need to care. So it's important to note that as more and more service providers are being consumed for use by public and private organisations, and the different parts of solution management that are being spread across different teams, one does not have to necessarily target a specific function or integration or even a specific organisation anymore in order to reach the same result of breaching a solution or compromising information. By targeting a third party, it may not also be obvious in the first instance that a particular organisation is the intended target. So if that's the case, they may not necessarily be prepared to respond. And so organisations need to start having their guard up at all times at their boundaries. So because, going back to the Qantas breach and the Muse software attack, one breach or attack on one service provider can just as easily affect many other organisations. And smaller third parties may be an easier target than the intended target. As I said, the weakest link, as they may not have the bandwidth to properly secure their solutions or train their staff the way that larger organisations do. Why target one organisation or a specific organisation when you can just target a third party that provides a service offering to so many more global organisations? Better bang for your buck. But please don't do that. I do want to highlight that management and ownership of risk are two different concepts. Third parties can help manage some of the risk, but it's not theirs to own. And there will always need to be someone within your organisation who is tasked with owning and accepting that risk that needs to be aware of the full picture. So this could be a product owner, could be a project manager or another C-level exec, but it doesn't always come down to the CISO or the CIO. So owning and accepting risk is their responsibility, but it's also the responsibility of the wider team. So those involved with managing and running the different moving parts to make sure that it actually works together. This does require trust, but as I'm sure you've all heard before, trust but verify. And by verify, you could hire a security consultant. As I've said before, my dad has been in the industry for a long time, so I am quite aware of how much people have a big dislike for auditors. But one of the things that we do is help highlight and communicate those deficiencies and those gaps within organizations and project solutions, and try to help improve the overall security. You know, zero-day vulnerabilities are a thing, and Dad actually highlighted this to me. The F5 and Cisco, they experienced big zero-day vulnerabilities within the last couple of weeks alone. You know, malicious actors are always going to be searching for that next big gap to exploit before we become aware of them. So it's impossible to implement prevention 100%, so we should be focusing on resiliency and responding. And as I said, security consultants can help with that. So there will always be different people across different organizations, different teams, especially as we continue moving into the public cloud space. Again, the whole alphabet soup playing a part and with different skill sets. But they all have something to contribute in helping secure and manage the overall solution. They fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And if one piece is missing, the whole picture falls apart. So it doesn't matter if you have the best defense in depth or the most hardest impenetrable boundaries, if the malicious actor is going to be able to come in, find their way in from the inside. So to answer the question from the very beginning, whose responsibility is it anyway? You. You are responsible, but, small caveat, we also have a responsibility for and to each other to help keep things moving securely and also protect one another online and everyone else's information. So thank you so much for listening, and if you have any other questions or want to discuss any of what I've talked about or even last year's stuff, please come find me or connect and send me a message on LinkedIn. Thank you.
I am a super genius.